As you know that the politicians, economists, and the policy makers think that inflation is not a good thing for an economy. The question is, then why do we see so much inflation? As you know that there is nothing intrinsically desirable about inflation, and since we know that a high rate of money growth does not happen of its own accord, it must follow that in trying to achieve other goals, because for the other goals achievement, any government is increasing the supply of money. In this particular topic, we are trying to examine the government policies that are most common source of inflation. The major objective of the government is to achieve the high employment target. The government is entrusted to give employment to each and every citizen. Then what will be the result of this policy? So with this analysis, you can easily see that what will happen to the price level if the government want to combat the serious unemployment issue by increasing the supply of money. As you know that high employment is the major objective of the government. For example, the United States government is committed by law to promote high employment. But in practice, the government has often pursued a high employment target with little concern about the inflationary consequence of the policy. And that was true especially in the mid 1960s and 1970s, when the US government began to take a more active role in attempting to stabilize unemployment. In the mid 1960s and 1970s, the US federal government tried to stabilize unemployment or tried to combat the issue of unemployment, but in the result, they gained a high inflation. So, two types of inflation can result from an active stabilization policy. Number one, cost push inflation. Number second, demand pull inflation. Actually, cost push inflation occurs because of negative supply shocks or a push by workers to get higher wages. As you know that there are different negative supply shocks occur. For example, the oil embargo. This is a negative supply shock. Or you can see that workers or laborers are trying to get higher wages. The laborers in any organization or in a company or in an industry or in the labor union or in the labor market, they are trying to increase their wages. So if the laborers are pushing wages up, and similarly, if there is a negative supply shock, or with these two occurrences, the cost push inflation will occur. So very simply, we can say that cost push inflation will occur because of the negative supply shock or a push by workers to get higher wages. On the other hand, demand pull inflation will result when policymakers pursue policy that shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. We are using the aggregate demand and aggregate supply analysis to examine how a high employment target can lead to both types of inflation. First, we are going to discuss the cost push inflation. Look at this diagram. Suppose the economy is initially at the equilibrium point at 1. You can see here that aggregate supply 1 touches aggregate demand 1. So we can say that the economy is initially at point 1, where the price level is P1 and the economy is at the natural output. Now we are going to analyze the effect of a negative supply shock or when the workers push up their wages. Now suppose that workers decide to seek higher wages. The effect of such an increase is to shift the aggregate supply curve leftward to A is 2. Why? As you know that wages consist of approximately 70% of the cost of production. If the government fiscal and monetary policy remains unchanged, the economy would move to point 1 dash. AD1 intersects A is 2 and P1 is the new price level. It means that the price level has increased from point P1 to point P1 dash. The output level is Y dash, which is below the natural rate. So Y dash is less than YN. Now, what would activist policymakers with a high employment target do if this situation develop? Because the activist policymakers' main objective is the high employment target. Because of the drop in output and resulting increase in unemployment, they would implement policies to raise the aggregate demand curve. They will implement those policies due to which they can increase the aggregate demand. So it means that the aggregate demand curve will shift from AD1 to AD2. So we will move from point A dash to point B, where we are back on the natural output level, and here the price level is P2. The workers who have increased their wages have not fared too badly. The government has stepped in to make sure that there is no excessive unemployment, and they have achieved their goal of higher wages because the government has given in to the demands of workers for higher wages. And activist policy with a high employment target is often referred to as an accommodating policy. Other workers might now realize that their wages have fallen relative to their fellow workers because some of the workers are now enjoying a higher living standard. The other workers might realize that their wages have fallen relative to their fellow workers, and because they don't want to live behind, these workers will seek to increase their wages. The result is that aggregate supply curve shift leftward again. It means that we will move from point 2 to point 2 dash, where AG2 intersects A is 3, P2 dash is the price level here, and Y dash is the aggregate output level. So unemployment develops again. The activist policymakers will adopt a strategy that will again shift the aggregate demand from the original position. So the aggregate demand curve will shift from AD2 to AD3. It means that now we will move from point 2 dash to point 3, where we are now back to the natural output level. And suppose if this process continues, the result will be a continuing increase in the price level. We are having the price level P4. Okay, the economy is now in the equilibrium, or the economy is now producing at the natural output level, but the price level is P4. So look at, can you see the increase in the price levels? Initially, when we were at point 1, the price level was P1. Then we moved from point 1 to 1 dash, where P1 was the new price. Then we moved from 1 dash to 2, then 2 to 2 dash, then 2 dash to 3, from 3 to 3 dash, and then finally from 3 dash to 4. Now the new price level is P4. So you can see the increase in the price levels. That's why we can say that if this process continues, the result will be a continuing increase in the price level. And this is known as cost push inflation. What role does monetary policy play in a cost push inflation? This is a valid question. Actually, a cost push inflation can occur only if the aggregate demand curve is shifted continuously to the right. So in Keynesian analysis, the first shift in the aggregate demand curve to AG2 could be achieved by a one-shot increase in government expenditures. The activist policymakers are interested to increase the demand. How they will increase? So there are two options. One is known as the increase in the government expenditures, or simply decrease in government taxes, or simply we can say that if the activist policymakers adopt the expansionary fiscal policy, they can change the position of the aggregate demand curve to the right side. That's why we are saying that a cost push inflation can occur only if the aggregate demand curve is shifted continuously to the right. In Keynesian analysis, because I think in chapter uh, 24 we had discussed that Keynesians are known as activists and monetarists are known as non-activists. So, in Keynesian analysis, the first shift of the aggregate demand curve to AD2 could be achieved by a one-shot increase in government expenditures. If they increase the government expenditures by one shot, so the aggregate demand curve will shift from AD1 to AD2. Or similarly, if there is a one-shot decrease in taxes, same will be the result. But what about the next required rightward shift of the aggregate demand curve to AD3, and then the next and the next? We are shifting the aggregate demand curve from AD1 to AD2 just due to a one short increase in government expenditures. But what about from AD2 to AD3? How this shift will occur? And what about this shift from AD3 to AD4? That is below the natural rate. For example, the natural rate employment rate may be 5% or 6%. What they will do? Actually, they will try to achieve an output target greater than the natural rate level of output. This target level of output is marked as YT. Look at here. This is the Yn, which is the aggregate output level. This is actually the natural output level. But the question is that at this level, suppose the unemployment rate is 5%. Suppose if this level is 5%, and the policy makers have designed an unemployment target 4%, because the limits on the maximum level of government expenditure and the minimum level of taxes would prevent. That means you cannot apply the expansionary fiscal policy for a sustained time period. Why? As we discussed that there are limits. You cannot exceed the upper limit in the case of increase in government expenditures. And similarly, you cannot cross the lower limit, especially when we are talking about the uh, taxes. So there is a limit of increasing in government expenditures or cutting taxes. Hence, it cannot be used continually to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right, but the aggregate demand curve can be shifted continually rightward by continually increasing the money supply. Therefore, a cost push inflation is a monetary phenomena. Now, look at the case of demand full inflation. If this is the case, what the activist policymakers will adopt? What will be their strategy? Now, let me explain demand full inflation. Actually, you know that the goal of high employment can lead to inflationary monetary policy in another way. You know that even at full employment, unemployment is always present because of frictions in the labor market. Like for example, if we are producing at the full employment or if we are here at the natural output level, it is possible that some unemployment is there. So unemployment is always present because of frictions in the labor market. Now suppose if policymakers set a target for unemployment that is too low, If this is the target of the policymakers, if policymakers set a target for unemployment that is too low because it is less than the natural rate of unemployment, this can set the stage for a high rate of money growth and a resulting inflation. For example, if policymakers have an unemployment target, suppose 4% unemployment rate, what the policymakers will do, they will try to achieve an output target greater than the natural rate. Look at here. The natural rate is yn. This is the natural output level. What they will do, they will target to produce the output greater than the natural rate. Look at yt. Actually, yt level of output is greater than the natural level of output. We are here at point 1. To hit the unemployment target of 4%, policymakers enact policies to increase aggregate demand. What they will do, they will increase the aggregate demand. They will adopt policies to increase aggregate demand. And the effect of these policies shape the aggregate demand curve until it reaches AD2 and the economy moves to point 1 dash from point 1. So they will adopt different policies which will shift the aggregate demand from AD1 to AD2. Then the economy will comes here from point 1 to point A dash. Now output is at YT, which is the targeted output level. And the 4% unemployment goal has been achieved because here the unemployment target rate is 4%. Okay, now the economy is here at point 1 dash. It means the economy is producing, is working at YT output level, and the 4% unemployment rate goal has been achieved by the policymakers. Now suppose if the target unemployment rate was at the natural rate level, the unemployment rate is 5%, and the policymakers unemployment rate target is also 5%. So it means they are equal. If they are equal, there would be no issue. But however, because at YT the 4% unemployment rate is below the natural rate, but this is our target output YT, and at point and at YT the 4% unemployment rate is below the natural output because at the natural output level we have 5%, but at YT the target unemployment rate is 4%, which is below than the natural rate level. What will happen? Wages will rise and the aggregate supply curve will shift to A is 2. So we will move back from point 1 dash to 2. Now the economy is back at the natural rate of unemployment. But now look at here. We have a new price level which is P2, and you know that this P2 price level is higher than P1 because now we are here at point 2. We can stop here at point 2, but as you know that the target unemployment rate is below this level because at this level at point 2 the unemployment rate is 5%, but the policymakers target unemployment rate is 4%. So what will occur? Policymakers would again shift the aggregate demand curve rightward to AD2. Then they will try to shift the aggregate demand from AD2 to AD3 again. We will move from point 2 to point 2 dash. And now we are hitting the output target at point 2 dash. And the whole process would continue to drive the economy to point 3 and beyond. But look at the overall result. The overall result is a steadily rising price level, which is known as inflation. Again, from point 2 dash, we will move to point 3. But again, the policymakers will adopt a strategy, will adopt a policy that will shift the aggregate demand from AD3 to AD4. It means that we will move from 3 to 3 dash, and again from 3 to 4, and finally we will come here. But look at here, our target has been achieved at point 3 dash, not at point 4. So you can see that the price level has increased from P1 to P2 and then from P2 to P3. That's why we can say that the overall result is a steadily rising price level. How can policymakers continually shift the aggregate demand curve rightward? As you know that we have already seen that they cannot do it through fiscal policy. Why? Because of the limits on rising government expenditures and reducing taxes. So they have, if they want to adopt an expansionary fiscal policy, what they will do? They will increase government expenditures, and similarly they can reduce the tax level. But as I already discussed that there are limits, they cannot do it. Instead, they will have to resort to the expansionary monetary policy. They need to adopt an expansionary monetary policy. It means that the monetary authorities should increase the supply of money in the economy. So by this way, they can achieve the target. So this was the case of the demand pull inflation. As you know that the inflation described the results from policymakers pursuing policies that shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. This is called a demand pull inflation. This is known as a demand pull inflation. But in the previous topic, we discussed about the cost push inflation. Actually, the cost push inflation occurs when workers push their wages up. So we can say that both types of inflation will be associated with higher money growth. So we cannot distinguish them on this basis. There is no guideline. On this ground, we cannot differentiate between the two types of inflation. But demand pull inflation will be associated with periods when unemployment is below the natural output level. Keep this point in mind. This is very simple. Demand pull inflation will be associated with periods when unemployment is below the natural rate level, whereas cost push inflation is associated with periods when unemployment is above the natural rate. So in this case, unemployment, the target unemployment rate was below the natural output level. So this was the case of demand pull inflation. In the previous case, this situation was reverse. So to decide which type of inflation has occurred, we can look at whether unemployment has been above or below its natural output level.